When the Carter family moved into their new home, they never imagined what was hidden behind the old fireplace. What they found would change everything and awaken something that refused to stay buried. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And don't forget to subscribe for more mysterious true life stories. The house on Burwood Street stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood wrapped in silence and time. The Carter family, Thomas, Lydia, and their 12-year-old son, Oliver, arrived just before sunset. The air smelled of damp wood and old paint. To Thomas, a black man who had spent years saving every dollar to give his family a better life, this moment was supposed to feel like victory. But as he unlocked the front door, an odd chill crawled across his skin. Inside, dust floated in golden light. The house was big, bigger than anything they'd ever had. Yet something about it felt off. Lydia smiled, trying to sound cheerful. "It just needs a little warmth," she said, running her hand over the walls. Thomas nodded, pretending to agree, but his eyes were fixed on the fireplace. It sat in the center of the living room like a silent witness. Its blackened bricks were uneven, almost as if someone had patched them long ago in a hurry. He crouched down, touching one of the bricks. It felt colder than the rest. He pulled his hand back quickly. "Strange," he murmured. Oliver, who was exploring every corner with boyish curiosity, stopped beside him. "Dad, it looks weird," he said, "like it's hiding something." Lydia laughed softly. "Maybe it's hiding Santa Claus." But Thomas didn't laugh. Something deep inside him whispered that the boy was right. That night, after unpacking a few boxes, they sat together on the floor, eating takeout. Oliver kept staring at the fireplace. "Why is it colder near that wall?" he asked. Thomas glanced at the thermometer on his phone. The temperature really was a few degrees lower there. "Old insulation," he said quickly, though he didn't quite believe it himself. When they went to bed, Thomas couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made his mind race. He had fought his whole life to give his family peace, to prove to a world that often looked at him with suspicion that he could succeed, that a black man could build his own future. But that night, as the wind whistled outside, it wasn't society that kept him awake. It was the house. At around midnight, he heard a faint sound, like bricks shifting, slow and deliberate. He sat up, listening. Lydia was fast asleep beside him. He slipped out of bed and walked quietly into the living room. The moonlight poured through the window, illuminating the fireplace. The air around it felt heavier, colder. He took a step closer. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Still, his instinct screamed that someone, or something, was there. He crouched and brushed away some ash near the hearth. His fingertips touched something rough. A small piece of mortar broke off easily, too easily, as if it had been placed there recently. He straightened up, his heartbeat quickening. "Thomas," Lydia's sleepy voice came from behind. She rubbed her eyes. "What are you doing?" He forced a smile. "Just checking the fireplace." "It's nothing." She frowned. "You're worrying too much. Go back to bed." But he couldn't. After she left, he stood there for another minute, staring at the bricks that now seemed almost to stare back at him. He wanted to walk away, to convince himself it was all in his imagination. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the fireplace was watching, waiting. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the living room, soft and golden, making the house look almost normal again. Lydia hummed as she unpacked dishes, and Oliver ran around filming everything on his phone for a family vlog. "Day one in our new home," he announced proudly. "Mom's already cooking, and Dad's acting suspicious of the fireplace." Thomas smirked but didn't respond. Instead, he crouched down again, examining the same spot. The mortar line was thinner here. Someone had clearly filled it recently. "Maybe it's nothing," he muttered, but the words didn't sound convincing. Oliver leaned over his shoulder. "What if there's something behind it, Dad? Like treasure or a secret room?" Thomas chuckled. "You've been watching too many mystery shows." "Come on," the boy insisted. "Just look." Thomas sighed. "Fine. Tomorrow, when I have time, I'll take a closer look." That night, the house grew colder. The air had a strange weight, and even Lydia stopped humming. "Feels like the place doesn't want us here," she said half-jokingly. Thomas looked at her and forced a grin. It's just old wood settling. But his mind replayed the sound he'd heard last night, those slow, deliberate shifts in the wall. When the lights went out, sleep didn't come easily. Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. From the living room came another faint sound, the kind of low, dragging creak that makes your skin tighten. He sat up again, his pulse quick and sharp. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself. "Tomorrow, I'll find out what's inside that wall." Outside, wind brushed the old house, whispering through its cracks. Inside, the shadows deepened, curling around the fireplace like smoke. And in the silence that followed, one small sound broke the night. The faint click of something metallic deep inside the wall, as if whatever waited there had just awakened. Morning found the Carter house washed in a clean, pale light that made the night's worries feel distant, like a dream dissolving at the edges. Thomas rose early, careful not to wake Lydia, and padded into the living room with a mug of coffee and the quiet resolve of someone who has made a promise to himself. The fireplace waited in the center of the room, a square mouth of brick and shadow. He set the mug down, rolled his shoulders, and knelt. The brickwork told its own small story up close. Seams of mortar thicker in some places, thin as a pencil line in others. A scrape here, a smear there. The rhythm of the mason's hands interrupted at odd intervals. Thomas pressed his thumb to last night's suspicious line. The mortar had cured, but not like the rest. Its surface felt smoother, almost recent. He fetched a flathead screwdriver and a mason's chisel from the toolbox and slid the flat blade into the thinnest seam. The metal clicked against something hard. Oliver, drawn by the sound of clinking metal, appeared barefoot and bleary-eyed, clutching his phone. "You're doing it now? For the vlog?" He grinned and hit record without waiting for an answer. Day 2 in the Carter home mystery. Dad versus the brick. Thomas snorted. "I'm just checking. Careful. Keep back in case something crumbles." He worked slowly, prying the first brick loose with a careful twist. It gave way with a reluctant sigh, shedding a veil of dust. The second came easier, then the third. Each brick landed gently on a folded towel he had laid out to protect the floor. Behind them, the cavity was shallow at first, just darkness and soot-blackened plaster. But as more bricks came free, the cavity deepened, opening into a neat rectangular recess reinforced with old, dark wood. "Is there anything in there?" Oliver breathed. Thomas leaned in with a flashlight. The beam slid over surfaces that had not seen light in decades, and struck dull gray metal. He pulled back, heartbeat quickening. "There's something," he said softly. "Metal. A box, maybe." Oliver zoomed in with his phone. "No way." Carefully, Thomas removed 2 more bricks and then another, widening the hole until both hands could fit inside. He brushed away clotted dust and charflake, revealing a weathered steel face inset into the cavity. The edges were riveted. A small dial, cramped with flaking numbers, sat above a lever handle. A safe, not large, perhaps 2 feet wide, 18 inches tall, but heavy with the weight of whatever time had hidden there. Thomas stared, a thrill sliding through him. "It's a safe," he said, as though naming it might help it make sense. "Like, with treasure?" Oliver's voice rose, wonder and adrenaline making him bounce on his heels. "Dad, if we find pirate gold, we're changing the channel name to Carter Gold." "Or Carter Lawsuits," Thomas muttered, though a smile tugged at his mouth despite himself. He ran his fingers over the dial. The numbers were stiff, reluctant to move. He tried the handle. It didn't budge. "Try a combo," Oliver said. "Like 1, 2, 3, 4. "That's a password, not a safe." Thomas peered around the dial for a manufacturer's mark, but found only a faint oval stamp long since blurred to a ghost. He tested the handle again, then reached for a can of penetrating oil. "Stand back." He eased a little oil into the seams and waited. Lydia arrived mid-scene, hair wrapped in a scarf, robe belted tight. She took in the hole in the fireplace, the towel littered with bricks, the camera in Oliver's hand, and the metal set deep in the wall. "Thomas, what did I say about sledgehammers before breakfast?" "No sledgehammer," he said, lifting his hands. "Precision only. Look." She stepped closer, eyes widening. "Is that a real safe?" "Looks that way," he said. "Old, heavy." "How do we open it?" Oliver asked. "Very carefully," Lydia said, but there was a note under the T's, an apprehension she couldn't quite mask. "And then we call someone who knows what they're doing." For an hour, Thomas tried everything short of breaking the wall apart, gentle pressure on the handle after oil, tapping the dial to loosen the mechanism, listening with his ear close as he turned, slowly, patiently, hoping to feel the faint bite of a true notch. Nothing. The lock remained stubborn, a metal heart that had forgotten how to beat. They called a locksmith. He arrived near noon, a compact man with nerves that seemed sanded down by decades of coaxing secrets from steel. He introduced himself as Mason, then crouched in the dust, peered inside the cavity, and whistled softly. "Haven't seen one of these in a while," he said, running a fingertip along the dial. "Early mid-century. Nice little wall set. Whoever installed it didn't want anyone to know." "We didn't," Lydia said, folded arms loosening as curiosity edged out worry. Mason unpacked his tools, a small light, a stethoscope-like device, picks of a sort, though not for tumblers. His were for persuasion rather than trickery. He worked without drama, ear to the steel, fingers coaxing the dial in delicate turns, a millimeter at a time. The house grew quiet around him, as though it too held its breath. "Feel anything?" Oliver whispered. "Patience," Mason murmured. "Good locks are like old men, noisy when ignored, slow when noticed." Minutes ticked into nearly an hour. Then, barely audible, came a gentle internal clink. Mason's eyes flicked in satisfaction. "There you are." He nudged the dial through a final sequence and wrapped his hand around the lever. The first pull did nothing. He eased pressure, breathed out, and tried again. The lever yielded a fraction, stopping against some gummy resistance, and then, with a low, ancient groan, the door released its seal. The smell that rolled out was unmistakable. Paper shut away for decades, dust and time and a hint of soot. Inside lay no stacks of cash, no glitter of jewelry, just a bundle of folded yellowed paper tied with a gray ribbon that might once have been blue. Thomas reached in, hands steady, and lifted the bundle free. Back at the dining table, they untied the ribbon and unfolded the top sheet. The handwriting, a flowing script, had faded to a pale brown. Thomas read aloud haltingly at first, then more confidently as the sentences took shape. "To the designated reader and to those who come after, this letter pertains to my will and testament regarding the property at Burwood Street." The words wavered where moisture had touched the paper long ago. Names surfaced. Witnesses, a notary, a date more than half a century old, and then, written clear as a bell, Eleanor Finch. "That's the previous owner," Lydia said softly. "Or one of them." Thomas turned another page, careful not to tear what time had thinned. The second sheet was more damaged. Entire lines had fallen into the blank where ink had bled away. "It references disposition," he said, brow furrowed. "But it's incomplete. Looks like part of the text is missing. Maybe a page that wasn't stored in the same stack." He looked up. Disappointment and wonder mingled in his chest. A strange, tender ache. The safe, the letter, the name. They proved a story, but not the whole of it. Oliver, camera forgotten on the table, leaned in close. "This is still huge," he said. "A will in a wall safe. We just unlocked the house's origin story." Lydia offered a small smile. "We should have someone look at it. If it's real, it might matter legally." She hesitated. "And historically." Thomas nodded. though his eyes had wandered back to the fireplace, to the neat recess now yawning like a pulled tooth. "We'll take it to a lawyer. Today, if we can." He gathered the pages gently and slipped them into a protective envelope. They cleaned up the bricks and covered the cavity with a taped sheet of cardboard for the moment. The house looked temporarily mended, the wound bandaged, but it was impossible to pretend nothing had been revealed. The afternoon passed in quick, practical motions. Sandwiches eaten standing up, calls made, a laundry load thumped into the washer. By evening, the light outside dulled to blue, and the living room returned to its nighttime self, the fireplace a black square cut into the wall. Oliver couldn't stop replaying the locksmith's tiny, victorious grin when the lock gave. He narrated it to himself as if he were editing the vlog in his head. Click. Breath. The door sighs open. History exhales. He sat with his back to the couch, knees tucked, face lit by his phone's glow, scanning the footage he'd shot. Grainy dust motes swam in the beam like snow. Somewhere off camera, his father's voice sounded lower than usual, careful with each word he read from the letter. "Time for bed," Lydia called, softer now that excitement had ebbed into the steady rhythm of their second night in the house. "In a minute," Oliver said. He lifted the phone to catch B-roll of the fireplace, something moody for the edit. As he framed the shot, the screen's rectangle captured what his eyes had missed. A hairline fissure in the brick face beside the hearth, a thin, dark seam that traced a lazy curve just under the mantel. He lowered the phone, blinked, and looked again. There it was, small, nearly nothing, but not part of the original pattern. "Dad," he said, not loudly, testing the room the way one tests a lake with a toe. No answer. Thomas had gone to rinse coffee cups. Oliver set the phone down and crossed the rug. Up close, the fissure became a shallow blister, a thumb-sized bubble where the top layer of mortar had separated from what was beneath. He pressed lightly. The mortar flexed. A fragile scab of plaster flaked and dropped to the hearthstone with a whisper. Something pale showed underneath. Paper, or the edge of an envelope. His heart began to beat fast, bright like a strobe behind his ribs. "Dad!" he called now, voice jumping. "Come here!" Thomas came at once, drying his hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" Oliver stepped aside, eyes wide. "There. I didn't touch it more, I swear." Thomas knelt and blew gently, clearing the whisk of dust. The pale edge resolved into the corner of a sealed envelope tucked into a narrow void behind the loosest brick. The placement was purposeful. Not within the safe, but next to it, as though someone had thought better of keeping two related things in the same place. The envelope was clean compared to the safe's contents. Its paper a creamy off-white, the flap glued and intact, the face unmarked except for a small hand-drawn symbol at the corner, a simple looped flourish, like an initial without letters. He slid the tip of the screwdriver beneath the loosened mortar and eased the brick forward a finger's width, just enough. The envelope slipped free into his palm. Neither of them spoke. The house listened. "Should we wait for Mom?" Oliver whispered. "We'll show her," Thomas said, voice even, though his throat had gone dry. He turned the envelope over. No address, no date, only the faint impressed line of a fountain pen that had once pressed firmly. He lifted a butter knife from the mantel where he'd set it earlier and slid it under the flap, prying slowly so as not to tear the paper. The glue gave with a quiet crackle. He tipped the contents into his hand. A single folded sheet slid out. He unfolded it, one careful crease at a time. The handwriting matched the safe's letter. Elegant, sure. This page, though, had been better sheltered. The ink remained dark, the lines legible. Thomas read silently first, then aloud when the shape of the words steadied. "To the future holder of my home," it began. "If the safe alone does not make my intention plain, I leave this note apart, that it might be found by those with patience and care. This house is not merely walls and roof, it holds what I could not carry. Keep this home safe." Beneath the sentence, a name signed clear and simple, Eleanor Finch. He lowered the paper, feeling the quiet expand inside him like a tide. The sentence was not legal language, no clauses or codicils here, but it breathed a kind of will all its own. Oliver exhaled, a long, shaky breath. So she meant for us to find it, not just the safe. This. Thomas nodded, throat tight. She meant for someone to understand why, he said. He refolded the page and slid it back into the envelope as Lydia entered, sensing the weight in the room before she saw what Thomas held. "What did you find?" she asked softly. Thomas handed her the envelope. She read the short note, then lifted her eyes to the two of them. Something eased in her expression. Not relief exactly, but a recognition, like the feeling of a hand you did not know you were holding letting go. "We take both to a lawyer in the morning," she said. "The papers from the safe and this, together." "Together," Thomas echoed. They stood a moment longer in the living room, the three of them in a slow triangle of lamplight and shadow. The cardboard cover over the cavity rustled faintly as the heater kicked on. Outside, a small wind moved through the hedge and along the eaves. Inside, the house settled with a soft wooden groan, less ominous now, as if the bricks themselves approved that the second secret had not been left behind. "Okay," Lydia said, drawing them back to ordinary life. "Teeth. Bed. Tomorrow we find out what it all means." Oliver scooped up his phone, already framing the next scene in his head. Thomas gathered the letters, slid both envelopes into a larger sleeve, and tucked it into the drawer of the sideboard. He paused with his hand on the knob, then closed it gently. On his way down the hall, he glanced once more at the fireplace. With the cavity covered, it looked like a wound neatly dressed, a promise to fix what had been opened. He did not hear any clicks tonight, no whispered grit behind the bricks, only the quiet of a house that had decided, at least for now, to rest. They were at the law office before the building had fully shrugged off the morning. Frost clung to the hedges. The hallway smelled faintly of toner and coffee. In a glass-walled conference room, a paralegal made copies while a senior attorney in a slate suit, Mr. Aronson, adjusted his readers and spread the fragile documents on a blotter like a museum curator. Thomas sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands braided to hide their tremor. Lydia kept her palms flat on the table as if steadying it would steady her. Oliver, scarf still looped around his neck, filmed a few seconds of the room for his private archive, then tucked the phone away when Aronson cleared his throat. "The paper is genuine," the attorney said, voice even. He tapped the older sheets from the safe. "Mid-century stationery, watermarks as expected. Signatures consistent across the pages we can read. This," he lifted the cleaner page from the envelope, "isn't the formal will, but it supports intent. The two together tell the story the law likes best, continuity of ownership and intent to convey." "And practically?" Lydia asked. "What does that mean for us?" Aronson offered a small, dry smile. "Practically, Mrs. Carter, it means what you hoped it would. As of today, you have every legal right to this property that the chain of title can provide. I'll file the necessary confirmations. If anyone contests, we'll be ready." He looked to Thomas. "Congratulations. It isn't every day a wall gives you a house." Thomas exhaled a laugh that sounded more like relief breaking its shell. The attorney photocopied the documents with clinical care, returned the originals in a rigid sleeve, and shook each of their hands. When they stepped back into the cold, the winter light felt a shade warmer, as if the street itself had endorsed the verdict. For the first time since moving in, Thomas let himself imagine the house not as a question, but as a promise. A black family, his family, with a deed that could not be argued. They celebrated in simple ways: grocery store cupcakes with too much frosting, a thrifted lamp Lydia had been eyeing in the window down on Fenton. Oliver filmed a short "We Did It" clip that he sent to 3 friends and no one else. Not ready for strangers yet, not with the house's story still unfolding. By late afternoon, the sky dulled to pewter. The living room glowed softly, new lamp on, cardboard still taped across the cavity. The mantel cleared except for a low-glass candle and the framed photo of the 3 of them on a beach where the wind had mussed everyone's hair. "Feels different," Lydia said that evening,
curling her feet under her on the couch. "Like we finally fit." "Like the house exhaled," Oliver added. Thomas nodded. He wanted to agree without reservation, to surrender fully to the relief. But something inside him kept a small watchman on duty, not suspicion of the law anymore, but of the house itself. That watchman paced quietly as they locked up for the night, clicked off lights, and climbed the stairs. He woke to running water. It wasn't the polite drip of a faucet left imperfectly closed. It was the unapologetic rush of a tap turned full, filling a basin as if someone meant to drown the quiet. At first he thought it was from the bathroom, but the sound's weight tugged him down the hall, down the stairs, into the kitchen where moonlight lay in a pale band across the floor. The tap at the sink was open wide, water slapping the stainless steel. He crossed the tile and shut it with a decisive twist. As the stream tapered to a sulky hiss, he caught his reflection in the black window, a tall silhouette, shoulders squared against an empty night. "Oliver," he called softly, then louder. No answer. Upstairs remained still. He turned from the sink and stopped. Across the kitchen floor, a string of wet, muddy footprints curved away from the faucet and toward the living room. The shape of them was wrong for shoes, too wide for a child's bare feet and oddly smooth at the heel. They reached the rug and vanished into its pattern, then reappeared on the wood past it, half prints climbing toward the fireplace. The last one pooled shallowly just before the hearthstone, as if the foot had paused before stepping into the brick. Thomas's heart banged once, hard. He forced himself to breathe. "Old leak," he told himself, though the words rang false in the cold air. Something backed up. Maybe I'd tracked mud earlier and didn't notice. He knew he hadn't. He followed the prints with a dish towel, tamping them dry one by one. His palm trembled only a little. He checked the back door. Locked. The windows. Latched. When he returned to the living room, he stood before the fireplace a long moment, listening to the house breathe. It said nothing he could translate. By morning, the prints were gone, either mopped entirely away or surrendered to the grain of the floor. Lydia chalked the faucet up to plumbing. "Old pipes," she said, sipping coffee, steady by intention. "We'll have someone look next week." Oliver was fascinated, but not afraid. "Maybe the house is congratulating us," he joked, "like a weird champagne fountain." Thomas smiled for them. Inside, the watchman did not sit down. The day passed in errands and practicalities. Aronson's email with scanned confirmations, a stop at the hardware store, an argument with a curtain rod that refused to hold dignity. They ate late. They laughed. They told the house out loud that it was theirs now, and they meant to be good to it. After dishes, they each drifted to their rituals. Oliver to editing, Lydia to her book, Thomas to a repair list he'd begun on a yellow legal pad. Sometime after midnight, the house made a different sound. It began like the scuff of someone turning in bed, then lengthened into a slow, deliberate step, not above them but below, on the ground floor they had just cleaned. Thomas sat up before he was fully awake, listening with his whole skin. Another step, then another, spaced as though the walker was testing each board, learning the room by memory. He slid out of bed, barefoot and careful. The hallway was a dim river. At the top of the stairs he paused, letting his eyes adjust. The living room lay in a soft wash of streetlight filtered through the hedge. The mantel's candle, unlit since dinner, was a small, dark cylinder on the shelf. At first he saw nothing. Then he saw the fireplace, and something just to the right of it, faint as a water stain at the edge of vision. It was a suggestion more than a shape, a vertical smear of gray against gray, where the air was thicker and the shadows nested inside each other. It did not move. It did not have a face. But in the same way you know when someone stands behind you, Thomas knew it was a someone and not a something. "Hello?" he said, voice low, neither brave nor frightened, simply careful. The smear seemed to waver. The room cooled in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. The candle on the mantel made a tiny sound, the faintest pop, as if a wick long dead had remembered flame. The cardboard over the cavity rustled once and stilled.
Thomas? Lydia's voice, sleepy and alert all at once, rose behind him. He lifted his hand without turning. "It's okay," he said. "Stay there." He took 2 slow steps down the stairs, then a third, until the rug flattened cold under his feet. The smear resolved a fraction more, or he only imagined it did. He could feel the gravitational hum a person leaves when they breathe near you in the dark. That pressure just inside the ear that tells you you're not alone. He did not feel malice. He did not feel welcome. He felt watched. "Miss Finch," he said, surprising himself with the name on his tongue. "Eleanor." He pronounced it carefully, the way the letters like to be said. "We're keeping it safe. We'll keep it safe." Something changed then. Not a movement exactly, but a easing, the way a locked jaw unclenches. A small draft stroked his ankle and moved toward the kitchen, tugging the hairs on his leg as it passed. The smear thinned, like steam pulled through a sieve. The air slowly surrendered its chill back to the thermostat's work. The dark became only dark again. He stood there until the ordinary creaks returned. When he looked up, Lydia was sitting at the top stair, arms at her shins, chin on her knees. "Did you see?" she began, then stopped. "No, don't tell me. I'll never sleep." He sat beside her. They leaned their shoulders together, 2 people sharing both the same house and the same question. "Plumbing," he said softly. "Plumbing that knows your name," she murmured. "Thomas, what if it's not bad? What if it's protective?" He did not know whether he believed it. He liked that she had said it. They went back to bed and slept a little in the ordinary way, though Thomas woke once to a dream where a woman's hand, cold and dry as paper, pressed his shoulder not to hurt him but to insist. "Listen." The next morning, Oliver was animated and pale with sleeplessness. "Okay, don't freak out," he said over cereal. "But I think we have a ghost." "Nope," Lydia said, bright as sunshine thrown like a shield. "We have plumbing and drafts and a father who should consider melatonin." "I'm serious," Oliver said, lowering his voice. "I heard steps, like slow, careful steps, and I recorded something weird." He lifted his phone, scrubbed through a clip, and held it out. The video was grainy. A nighttime shot of the living room from the hallway. For a second, it was only the rectangle of the fireplace. Then a thin ribbon of light curled along the hearth as if the air itself had reflected streetlight wrong. A brief and gentle error. It vanished almost before Thomas could see it. "Glare," Thomas said, though the words sounded like a borrowed excuse. Oliver looked between them, weighing how far to insist. He settled for a single card placed carefully on the table. "Eleanor Finch," he said. The note said, "Keep this home safe." Maybe she's checking whether we mean it. No more filming at night, Lydia decided, with the precision of someone drawing a soft boundary around a tender place. "We'll have the pipes looked at. We'll check the locks twice. We'll light the candle." She glanced toward the mantel. For her, if that helps us help her. That evening, they did light it. A small wick took fire and burned with a steady, unshowy flame. The house fell into a new rhythm. Thomas changed the batteries in the smoke detectors. He oiled the front door hinges. He wrote plumber at the top of the list and thermostat calibration below it. It felt good to work with his hands, to meet the unknown with a sequence of known tasks. But the watchman inside him did not dismiss his post. When the wind stumbled across the roof, Thomas listened for a footstep inside that stumble. When the tap clicked in cooling, he heard the echo of a faucet reaching for pressure. Out of the corner of his eye, the fireplace kept trying on shapes. A coat hung on a peg that wasn't there, the hollow of a woman where shadow gathered. He kept telling himself what he believed about the world, that fear loses when you look at it straight, that most mysteries accept a reasonable explanation if you gather enough daylight and good wrenches. But as he stood alone that night staring at the brick face and the taped cardboard over the cavity, the words of the envelope returned to him with a hush he could feel in his teeth. "Keep this home safe." "Okay," he said aloud. Not to the room, not to the note, but to whatever had been entrusted to him by the hand that wrote it and the hands that hid it. I will. From the kitchen, the faucet held its tongue. The floorboards did not speak. The candle on the mantel burned down a clean 1/4 inch and did not flicker, as if an unseen breath had decided for this one evening to be still. The knock came at dusk, when the light thins enough to make every window into a mirror. Lydia was rinsing plates. Oliver was on the rug with his homework spread like a small city. Thomas was tightening the loose hinge on the front closet, pleased by the honest click it made when corrected. 3 rhythmic blows sounded on the front door. Not polite, not frantic, but flat like the back of a hand tapping a table to demand attention. Thomas straightened. "You expecting anyone?" he called toward the kitchen. "No," Lydia answered, drying her hands. Oliver looked up. The house stilled in the way houses do when they wait to see who's coming in. Thomas opened the door on the chain first. The man on the porch was tall and narrow, his frame made gaunter by a long, dirty coat that hung as if it had been rained on and never quite dried. His hair was flat with neglect. His eyes, sharp and pale, skipped briefly over Thomas before fixing on the dark behind him. Up close, he smelled like wet leaves ground under a boot. "This house," the man said, voice gravelly as a gravel road, "belongs to me." Thomas kept the chain in place. "Can I help you?" "You can help by leaving," the man said as if he were asking for salt. "You're trespassing." "Do you have some identification?" Thomas asked evenly. "Paperwork." The man lifted a plastic folder from under his coat and held it up to the crack. Inside lay photocopies with seals that gleamed under a smear of lamplight. Signatures, parcel numbers, a deed chain printed in a municipal font that tried to look unimpeachable. Thomas didn't look away from the man's face while his mind took inventory of the stamped shapes on the page. "Where did you get those?" he asked. "From the county, same as anybody," the man said. He smiled without humor. "Been waiting for the rightful turn. This house has always been mine. Now it's time to correct the record." Something in the way he said always lodged like a fishbone. Behind Thomas, the hall smelled faintly of the candle they had lit by the mantel. He thought of the note in the drawer. "Keep this home safe." He thought of the safe itself and the lawyer who had said continuity and intent. He thought of the taps finding their own mind at 3 a.m. and the faint shape he had greeted by name. "I'm not opening the door," Thomas said calmly. "If you believe you have a legal claim, you can take it to court. We'll bring our documents, you bring yours, that's how this works." The man's mouth thinned. His eyes slipped past Thomas again as if the living room could be possessed by gaze alone. "I already have the papers," he said. "Yours won't stand up. You and yours are just squatting." His glance traveled over Thomas's shoulders and hands, took in his posture, returned to his face with something like challenge. "You don't want this fight." "I don't," Thomas agreed. "That's why we'll do it the right way." He closed the door to the chain. The man didn't step forward, didn't pound, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, held by some private wire that kept him perpendicular to the threshold, then turned and walked down the steps, his coat dragging a soft, dirty wake. When his figure slid off into the hedge gloom, Thomas shut the door, slid the deadbolt, and stood there with his palm on the wood as if the door were a living thing whose heart he hoped to slow. Lydia had come into the hall with a dish towel clenched in her hand. "What did he show you?" "Papers," Thomas said. He tugged the chain free and reset it. "Looks real enough to throw a scare at a glance." Oliver hovered close, full of the particular bravery of kids who trust the person in front of the door to be a wall. "What do we do?" "We take our documents to the judge tomorrow," Thomas said. "We let the county registrar and our lawyer do their jobs. Tonight, we lock up, and we don't let dread take the lease." They did lock up. They checked the windows and the back door twice. Thomas slid a chair under the front knob not because he believed it would be needed, but because doing so made the blood quiet in his ears. Lydia texted Aronson to ask for the earliest possible appointment. His reply came back in 2 minutes. 11:30 a.m. Bring everything. After Oliver was in bed, Lydia sat at the kitchen table while Thomas laid out the materials, The sleeved originals from the safe and the envelope. The attorney's copies. Aronson's email printouts confirming the filings. He stacked them in a neat column, squared the edges with the flat of his palm. The neatness steadied him the way level ground steadies a foot after a stumble. "I hate that he looked past you," Lydia said after a while, voice low, "like he could see around you to our home." Thomas's laugh was small and hard. "He looked through me," he said. "Some folks never learn how to see." They left the envelope where it had lived since the lawyer's visit and went upstairs together, arms touching on the rail. In bed, they lay on their backs and stared at the ceiling as if the plaster carried news. Sleep eventually found them by the slow, patient route. Before dawn, the house spoke again. Not water this time, not a footstep, a sound like paper sliding across a table. Thomas sat up, heart already awake. The house was dark, but some part of him knew exactly where the sound had come from. He moved fast and quiet into the hall, down the stair, through the living room whose shapes he now knew as well in the dark as in light. The kitchen lamp was off. The table was as they'd left it except for one thing. The topmost plastic sleeve had shifted half an inch, canted so that its corner touched the rim of the bowl in which they kept the mail. He stared. Cool air moved along the baseboards, a tide you could feel with the bones of your feet if you stood still enough. The candle on the mantel was a dark stub in the corner of his eye. He whispered absurdly, "I hear you." He set the sleeve back square and remained there for a minute with his hands on the table's edge, as if anchoring both himself and the papers to the same surface. When he went back up, Lydia turned toward him in her sleep, and he gathered her in, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a house is to hold the people inside it. In the morning, the mirror did its best to erase the thinness from under their eyes. They dressed with the efficiency of a habit they had earned. Present what is needed where it will do the most good. At the law office, Aronson ushered them in, glanced over their shoulders as if expecting a broader storm, and listened while Thomas described the man on the porch and the papers in the plastic folder. "Fraud happens," Aronson said, the syllables precise as a stamp. "People print seals like they print party invitations. If he files anything, the registrar will flag it when it doesn't align with the deed chain we've established." He slid a form across the table. "Let's get ahead of it. Petition to affirm quiet title. Motion for temporary injunction against harassment or unlawful detainer. We'll put the court between you and any nonsense." Thomas signed where he was told. Lydia signed. Aronson made copies with that same care that dignifies paper into proof. He shook Thomas's hand last, holding it a second longer than needed. "You did right. You didn't escalate at your door. You came here, let the process do the work." Back home, the house felt both more theirs and less certain. As if in agreeing to have a referee, it had been reminded that referees imply a game. Oliver asked a dozen questions and then asked none, sensing the subtle line between air that can hold another worry and air already full. They tried to live inside ordinary acts. Lydia made soup and tucked dill into it the way her mother always had. Thomas shoveled the small drift of leaves that had gathered against the stoop. He stood there, a moment longer than necessary, looking up and down the street. The hedges held their breath. The man did not return. Night settled early and heavy. They clicked on the porch light and drew the curtains. Even with that soft boundary, the windows felt like eyes. Oliver wanted to sleep downstairs on the couch. Lydia said no, but brought his sleeping bag down after he'd gone to bed, a compromise he would never notice. Thomas set the chair under the knob again and placed the toolbox within reach. Not for drama, not for a fight, but for comfort. The house waited. Houses are good at waiting. Sometime after midnight, he woke to a hush so deep it felt like a held note. He lay still and listened into it. Lydia breathed slow beside him. A branch brushed the siding and then decided against it. From the kitchen floated a whisper. Not water, not paper. A syllable rubbed the wrong way, the way a word sounds when you press it against the grain of a dream. He slid from bed and let the hall's dim guide him. At the landing, he paused. Below, the living room was a field of grays. The fireplace sat in its square, the cardboard cover taped with 4 perfect X's. For a long 4 heartbeats, nothing lived in the room but the idea that something might. Then, as soft as a leaf turning, he heard it. A woman's voice where there was no woman, not speaking words at first so much as shaping breath in the outline of them. The sound didn't come from the hearth or the kitchen. It seemed to constellate in the space between, like fog that had decided to pretend at language. He stood where he was, because the moment felt like a place you could fall from if you moved. He said the name he had said before, the one that made the watchman in his chest sit up in respect. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I hear you." The fog gathered itself into actual words the way a hand gathers thread. The whisper was close to his ear and everywhere at once. "Protect this home, Thomas." The syllables were not a plea and not an order. They were something older, the way instructions sound when they are both a burden and a blessing. He closed his eyes. "I will," he said. "I am." The air warmed by a degree so slight that only a person in the habit of measuring rooms by feeling would mark it. The hush softened around the edges. Somewhere, Wood remembered how to be Wood. He waited until the ordinary clock over the stove resumed its small, courageous ticking. Then he went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed until the feeling of the whisper receded enough that he could lie down without shaking. When morning came, he told Lydia only this much. "We're doing the right thing. We'll let the court do its work." She nodded. Oliver ate his cereal and asked whether they could buy a second lamp for the living room to make it cozier, and the request fell into place like a stone that had been waiting for a pocket. Thomas went to the drawer, touched the sleeves, and thought of signatures. He looked at the fireplace and thought of the voice. He checked the chair under the door and thought of the man. And then he thought of the simplest truth, the one that had been trusted to him before any court had stamped any page. "Protect this home." He said it aloud once more, not to argue with fear, but to give the house something clear to stand on. The walls seemed to hold the words the way good walls hold heat. Outside, the street moved into an ordinary day. Inside, Thomas picked up his list and his tools and began again to do the small work that keeps a promise kept. The court hearing was brief, but the air inside felt heavier than its walls. Thomas sat beside Lydia on a wooden bench that had seen more stories than anyone wanted to count. The hum of whispered conversations filled the chamber. When the bailiff called their case, Thomas stood tall, the same way he had taught Oliver to stand when life tried to make him small. Across the aisle sat the man from the porch, now clean-shaven but still wearing that same cold expression. His lawyer shuffled through papers, pretending confidence. The judge, a gray-haired woman with steady eyes, lifted the first document. "This is the will of Eleanor Finch, dated 1956, she said, authenticated, notarized, and verified by the county registrar's office. Mr. Carter, you have presented these as evidence of lawful inheritance?" "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas answered, his voice steady but tight. The opposing lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client maintains that these papers are forged, created to exploit a defunct estate." The judge didn't look impressed. "And your proof?" The lawyer hesitated. "The deed transfer was falsified," the judge interrupted, holding up the neighbor's papers. "Filed using a stolen notary seal and a non-existent registrar code. We verified it this morning." The room went still. The man in the coat slumped back in his chair, the color draining from his face. Lydia squeezed Thomas's hand. Oliver, who sat quietly in the back with a friend of the family, felt his heart race. The judge continued, her voice firm. "The rightful ownership of the property on Burwood Street is hereby affirmed to Mr. Thomas Carter and his family. This court also issues a restraining order against Mr. Langley, who will serve time for property fraud and falsifying official documents." The gavel struck once, a sound that seemed to split the months of dread cleanly in half. Thomas exhaled deeply, his shoulders softening for the first time in weeks. When he turned toward Lydia, she was already smiling through tears. Outside the courthouse, the air was sharp and bright. Reporters moved past for bigger stories, and no one noticed the small family standing together on the steps, which was exactly how Thomas wanted it. He looked up at the pale winter sun, took Lydia's hand, and said quietly, "It's over." But when they returned home that evening, the house didn't feel quite the same. The tension that had lived in its corners seemed gone, replaced by something lighter. The front door creaked open softly, as though greeting them. Even the fireplace, once a source of unease, seemed gentler now, its bricks catching the last glow of the day. Oliver ran ahead, placing the framed court order on the mantel. "Now it's official," he said proudly. Thomas chuckled. "Let's make it feel like home again." They unpacked candles, soft jazz hummed from an old speaker, and Lydia set out a simple dinner. When the first match struck, the small flames reflected off the hearth's black iron. For a heartbeat, Thomas thought he saw movement, a shimmer of light above the fire, forming something almost like the outline of a woman. "Did you see that?" Lydia whispered. He nodded slowly, but smiled. "Maybe she's still here, making sure we kept our promise." They sat together long into the evening, talking about everything and nothing, about the fear they'd lived through, about the future they were finally ready to shape. Outside, the wind moved gently through the street, and for the first time since they'd moved in, the house made no sound, except the soft crackle of wood and laughter. A year passed. The Carters had filled the rooms with life, new paint, new laughter, new roots. On the anniversary of the court ruling, they invited neighbors for a quiet dinner. Candles flickered across the living room as people clinked glasses and shared stories. The house that had once felt haunted now pulsed with warmth. Later that night, after the last guest left, Thomas lingered by the fireplace. The flames danced lazily, and he could almost hear a faint whisper beneath the crackle. Familiar, gentle, unmistakable. "Keep this home safe." "I will," he whispered back. "Always." He placed a small bouquet of white flowers beside the mantel, next to the framed will of Eleanor Finch. The home was silent again, but not empty. Somewhere in its quiet, something, or someone, was finally at peace. The Carter family slept soundly that night. No footsteps, no whispers, no fear. Only the warmth of a house that had chosen them, and a promise kept forever. The Carter family finally found peace, and so did the spirit that once guarded their home. Some secrets are meant to be discovered, just to remind us that every house has a story. If this story moved you, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.